unashamed. I mean, they're seriously dedicated. I had some
All right, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. Welcome to Epic Fail. Was Darwin Wrong? We're excited to have you here. And we are Maranatha Christian Fellowship and International Student Outreach, student groups here at the University of Minnesota. I am Pastor Parnell Mahoney. And tonight's presentation is the first of 3 in this room. So we will also have a different presentation tomorrow night and a different presentation on Friday night. And if you don't know about that and you're curious, we're going to mention those at the end of the presentation. And also we have flyers on the information table over there with the other presentations. So if you want a reminder, grab a flyer over there before you leave. And there's a sign up on that information table and information about our church and other interesting things on this subject. So feel free to check it out before you leave. So why are we doing this presentation? Well, you've heard of the expression, we are all stardust. Have you guys heard that expression? We're all stardust. Who's heard that before? Yeah, right. So that's kind of a nod to evolutionary assumptions, right? Saying that we basically came from the stars, right? And it's used by some people to attempt to ascribe us with lofty origins, right? And but the thing is, evolutionary theory leaves us wondering, you and I, if we have real intrinsic value or meaning, right? And there's another explanation that we're excited about, which is why we're doing these presentations, that points to our supreme origins and our value and our destiny. For in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them. And then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. He breathed the breath of life into the man's nostrils, and the man became a living person. So these are an account of alternative origins to just time, chance, and accident, to the idea that we have no intrinsic value or meaning. And so we believe these things are true, and we're excited to present you evidence tonight and in the future presentations. So we're excited. The presentation tonight is going to be 1 hour and 15 minutes. That's what I think. So we'll see if they can hold to that. And if you hear them speeding up, that's because they're trying to not go 1.5 hours. There's going to be a Q&A following the presentation. And a little bit about our speakers. Dave and Mary Jo Nutting live in Grand Junction, Colorado. Dave is originally from Grand Junction, and they both like hiking. Dave is an avid fly fisherman. Mary Jo is from Mankato here in Minnesota, and she enjoys time with her grandkids. They are both former evolutionists, and they have carefully studied the scientific issues and become convinced of the truth of creation. They are founders and directors of Alpha Omega Institute and have been teaching on creation science for nearly 40 years. And they have advanced degrees, Dave in mathematics and geology, and Mary Jo in biology, with a science education emphasis. They have both taught at the high school and the college level. Now, these presentations are being recorded on Zoom, and they're live on Zoom. So if you want more information on that, let me know, and I can give you the link for checking the recording, or for tomorrow night or Friday night. But without further ado, tonight's presentation, and Mary Jo, please welcome her.
Well, good evening. We are happy to be here with you. All right. Make sure, yeah, we're trying to do Zoom and a live presentation, so we'll see how this goes. Like Parnell said, I grew up in Mankato, and I went to church every Sunday, I think, when I was there, and I believed in the Bible, I believed in creation, I believed in Jesus was my savior. But at the same time, I was going to public school. And in the public school, I learned a different idea. It was called evolution. And I thought evolution was proven science by the way that it was taught. Now, sometimes they'd call it a theory, but it was always taught as if it was a proven fact. And so consequently, I ended up believing in evolution. And so what I did in high school was draw a big line down the middle. I put creation in the Bible on one side. I put evolution in what school and what I thought was science on the other side. And they never mixed. But then I went to church college, my first year of college. And at that church college, they told me Genesis was a myth that was written for primitive people who couldn't understand the science of evolution. They said those days were really periods of time, millions of years long, and somehow God must have used evolution as his method of creating. I thought, oh, good, now that line can come down, right? I can believe in evolution and I can believe in creation at the same time. That worked for me for a little bit. At least it kept me from throwing my faith out totally. But I was pretty confused. After that, I went to a public university, went to what was at that time Mankato State University, now Minnesota, Southern University, something like that, MSU. And at that college, of course, it was public university, so all I ever got was evolution. And they didn't teach it as a theory, even though they might call it as theory. It was the only thing we were taught. So the logical thing at that point in time to do is, if evolution truly is proven, the logical thing to do would be throw the Bible out. Well, I praise God, I wasn't quite that logical. But what I did do was accept the idea of evolution. So eventually I went out to Colorado State University, graduated from there with a degree in biology, met Dave out there. And after we graduated, we went to teach public high school down in New Mexico, and later on up in Alaska to a small church college that also taught evolution. So I was very well indoctrinated in the evolution model. I know it very well. While we were in Alaska, though, something happened. I was shopping in a secondhand store one day, and I found a little book called Evolution, The Fossils Say No. I bought that book for 5 cents, and God took a 5-cent book and turned our lives around with it. And we didn't believe it right at first. I read it, Dave read it. We thought this guy's either nuts or he knows something we don't know. And so we said, we better start doing some thinking and researching. And as we did that, we studied not just what we were told in the textbooks, not just what we learned in school, but we went to study the actual evidence and that, you know, what they were saying in the journals and so on. And what these crazy people who thought they were creation scientists, what were they saying? But you know what, over a period of time, as we studied, we evolved from evolutionists to creationists, and it didn't take millions of years to do that.
Is that this slide that you want to be showing?
That's fine for now, yeah,
Okay, you haven't advanced yet?
not yet.
Okay, just checking.
Yeah, thanks. So what we want to present in these next 3 nights is some of these evidences that we've learned over the years, and there's so much. And so if you're here tonight and you believe in evolution, we say welcome. We are really glad you're here. Maybe you're a believer in creation. We are really glad you're here too. And I hope what you will do with this information is just to take it tonight, listen with an open mind and an open heart, and start to evaluate the evidence for yourself. Because what we've found is what we're taught in school, oftentimes we just absorb it and we think it's true, but it needs to be reevaluated. We need to really stop and think about it for ourselves. And so we want to invite you to do that tonight. If you have questions, please save them till the end, and then we'll have a Q&A time. And otherwise we'll get too distracted with Q&A and we'll never get through the information we want to get through. So tonight, biological proofs of evolution fail. Now, I know people will say they're not proofs, they're evidences, but they're always taught as if these are really good evidences. You know, when you really get them down to it, there's really only 2 models of origins. I mean, either things are here supernaturally or they're here naturalistically. And sometimes we can try to combine these two and say, well, there may be a supernatural creator, but he used evolution. And I tried that for a while. I found out later it was bad science and it's also bad theology. So let's just look at the two models of creation and evolution. Lots of people think evolution is science, but creation is a religious myth. In reality, both of these things are religious in nature. Both of them require faith. I mean, if you're a creationist, it requires faith in a supernatural creator, right? The evolution model requires faith in what? In time and chance and natural processes. These are the, you might say, almost the gods of evolution, the mechanisms of evolution, time, chance, natural processes. Evolution really is a belief system posing as science. And that's when we duck, right? Because it's being taught as if it's science. But when we really think about it, no one was there in the beginning. There were no human observers to observe the beginning of the world, the beginning of the universe, the origin of life. No human observers there. Neither was there anybody to observe the creation except the creator, the designer who did it. And so in the end, both of these things require faith. Oftentimes, as we look at evidence, we look through different colored lenses. We call that your worldview. And if you were to look at a white wall with red colored glasses, what color would that wall look?
Red.
Look red? What about if you have blue glasses? Looks blue. What if you have glasses that say evolution all over them? Because that's all you've ever been taught. Everywhere you look, you're going to see evolution. Same way, if all you ever see is creation, that'll be all you ever see. What we want to encourage you to do tonight is, clean your glasses. Let's look at the evidence and see if we can come up with the interpretation that fits best. Because the worldview, your worldview can affect your interpretation of data. When you think of it, the data doesn't say anything, does it? I mean, if we have a rock, we can take that rock, we can weigh it, we can measure it, we can grind it up and figure out what chemicals make up that rock. You have all kinds of different things that you could observe about that rock, but those observations would be the same whether you're an evolutionist or creationist. The data itself is the same. What is it that's different then? It's the interpretation of that data that is the same. That's why you can have two perfectly good scientists looking at the very same data, and one can go, wow, isn't evolution wonderful? And another can say, what an awesome creator we have. They're looking at the same data. We have the same physical world we live in, whether we interpret it from an evolution model or from a creationist world model. So tonight, what we want to look at is some biological evidences, and we're going to be looking at some of the supposed evidences of evolution, the kinds of things that are in the textbooks, the kinds of things that convince students that evolution is true. And we're barely going to hit the tip of the iceberg in these 3 days. There's so much we could look at. So we're going to be looking at things through these 4 categories tonight: the idea of change, similarity, junk, and imperfection. What do we mean by change? Well, evolution simply means change, doesn't it? That's the definition of the word evolution, is change. So do things change?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you believe in evolution then? But it depends. What do you mean by change, right? How much change? And what kind of change are we talking about? Are we talking about the idea of mega evolution, or sometimes called cosmic evolutions, starting with a big bang? That big bang supposedly generated all that we see in this universe, the chemicals and everything that we see came from that big bang, according to this model. Now, those molecules then got together to form bigger molecules. Well, in the beginning, no molecules, even just elements that came together to form molecules that came together to form the very first living cells, and so on. That idea, you might say, the molecules to man idea, or maybe evolution with a capital E, the overall theory of evolution. Are we talking about that kind of evolution? Or are we talking about biological evolution, the new types, new creatures, new body plans, organisms? Or are we talking about what we might call microevolution or adaptation, which is these kinds of changes, but within a basic kind or basic type? So we can see a variety of frogs, they're still frogs, or we can see a variety of dogs and they're still dogs. Whenever dogs mate, they have puppies, they never have kittens. You do not see dogs changing into another type of animal. And so we might call this adaptation or variation within that kind. So you can get big dogs, you can get little dogs, Chihuahuas, St. Bernards, Dalmatians, all varieties of dogs, but they're still dogs. That's what we mean by these basic created types or basic kinds. So we could say, yes, that is variation, but it's not evolution in the sense, at least, of macro or mega evolution. And if you wanted to call it microevolution, we can talk about that, but it really is just adaptation within that kind. What are we seeing here? We're seeing variation, yes, but evolution, no. One of the evidences, classic evidences of evolution, were the Galapagos finches. Remember, Charles Darwin was on this voyage around the world on the ship called the Beagle, and he went to the Galapagos Islands. He observed various types of finches, and he noticed they had different sizes and shapes of beaks, and their bodies were a little bit different. He supposed that these finches had come from a pair of ancestral finches that had flown over from the South America, and over time, those variations had come in. Is that evidence of evolution? Perhaps microevolution. I think it's better explained, though, by adaptation or just changes within the kind. Because what do you start out with here? You start with finches. What do you end up with? Finches. Nothing fundamentally new, is there? Variation within that finch type. Now people are looking at the Darwin's finches and thinking, well, maybe these changes are due to epigenetics. Epigenetics, that's a relatively new field of study within the last, 10, 20 years, something, I guess. But epigenetics is tags or markers on the DNA, on the chromosomes, on the DNA molecules that can influence the way the DNA is expressed. And so those kinds of changes can be observed. Here's a quote from Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins in 2019. He says, scientists have discovered that the genes are very similar among the various species of these finches. They discovered that epigenetics correlated closely with beak shape and size among the species. Epigenetic mechanisms clearly remain a major player in adaptation. Well, is that evolution? I guess it depends on your on your definition of evolution. And so the peppered moths or the finches, we can just kind of say, yes, there's changes, but they're changes within some limits. What about peppered moths? Another classic example of evolution. The idea was that these moths were around in Great Britain before the Industrial Revolution. At that point in time, the air was nice and clean. The tree bark was light colored. There were light moths and dark moths. The light ones were better camouflaged against the light colored tree bark. And over time, people say that the birds ate more of the black ones. But then the Industrial Revolution came, and the story is that then the air was polluted and the tree bark became darkened, and over time you see more dark ones than light ones. This is a classic example that's been used for many, many, many years. Question is it true? Well, when we look at it, first of all, we start out with what? Moths, light ones and dark ones, by the way. What do you end up with? Moths, light ones and dark ones. Nothing fundamentally new. And so we're possibly, if this is a good example even, you may see relative changes in numbers. And some people might define that as evolution, but can it really explain how do we go from molecules to man? You stop and think about it, there's still moths. They start out moths, they stay moths. And in fact, this whole idea has come under scrutiny as people are doing more research, and they went back and they looked at the original experiments and the original articles that were written about these moths. They found out that really it may just be a hoax anyway. The original pictures, they had to stick the moths on the trunks of the trees to get the pictures that are in the textbooks. These moths are nocturnal. They fly around at night, and during the day they go up in the leaves of the tree. They don't even normally rest on the bark of the tree, on the trunks of the tree. And so maybe the whole thing is just made up story anyway. Jonathan Wells exposed his peppered moth myth in his book in 2002, and then it was confirmed again in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology. You can read that if you want to do that. What about antibiotic resistant bacteria and viruses? We hear a lot about that today with all the COVID stuff, and all everything coming out of that. Things mutate, right? We hear about that. Bacteria mutates, viruses mutate. But is that evolution? They stay the same kind of basic creature that they were to start with. Same kinds of bacteria. You start out with bacteria, you end up with bacteria, nothing fundamentally new. Now, yes, if you take a petri dish and you grow some bacteria on there, you can throw antibiotics on, and guess what? Some of those bacteria probably survive, some will die. The ones that survive go on to reproduce, and pretty soon our population becomes resistant to that antibiotic. But they're still the same kind of bacteria. So it doesn't really demonstrate to you how do you go from molecules to man? How do you get fundamentally new characteristics, fundamentally new traits coming about? I believe that as you look at the world of living creatures, we see lots of variation. But what we have for actual evidence is evidence of variation, but not change from one kind of thing to another kind of thing. What about the races? Here we see ideas. Darwin had lots of ideas about the races. In fact, if you look at his book, The Descent of Man, he thought that the races that we see on the earth today came from differing types of apes and monkeys. And he thought some races were more advanced than others. Some were more closely related to apes than others. Here's a quote from him in the descent. This is coming from an article exposing what Darwin had in his book, The Descent of Man, which was published in 1871. That's 10, 12 years after his original book on the origin of species. He says, not only does Darwin believe in white supremacy, he offers a biological explanation for it, namely that white people are further evolved. Darwin imagines that Europeans are more advanced versions of the rest of the world. These were Darwin's ideas. This purportedly superiority justified to Darwin the domination of the inferior races by Europeans. As white Europeans, he said, exterminate and replace the world's savage races, and he called them savage races, are as great apes go extinct. Darwin says that the gap between civilized man and his closest evolutionary ancestor will widen. He says the gap will eventually be between civilized man and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of at present between the Negro, this is Darwin's words, remember, or the Australian Aborigines he's referring to, and the gorilla. Darwin's theory claims that Africans and Australians, Aborigines, are more closely related to apes than Europeans are. These were his evolutionary ideas. These were racist ideas. Now, some people will claim Darwin was not a racist, but nevertheless, in his book, his theory was racist. He said the spectrum of organisms is a hierarchy here with white Europeans at the top and apes at the bottom. This is a text is coming from the commentator here. In Darwin's theory, colored people fall somewhere in between. In between what? Europeans and apes. Modern human is essentially restricted only to white Europeans, with all other races viewed as somehow subhuman. These are Darwin's ideas. These are evolutionary ideas that have come down through our society over time. And we see, even today, when we see this, there's so much things being taught about racism, and we see it happening in our society. We see these controversies rooted in a lot of what Darwin was talking about way back when. From a biblical perspective, the Bible says that all human beings came from two originally created human beings. And so where did all the skin colors come from? From the built-in variation, we believe that in the beginning, those two human beings had potentially the variation to create all these different skin colors. And you can demonstrate it simply with a Punnett square. You look at a Punnett square that's displayed here, and this is a very, very simplified version of this thing. But just based on two characteristics here, if you have an entirely heterozygous condition, which means you have a dominant recessive genes, two parents with medium skin color with the most potential variation, we can get all the way from lightest light to darkest dark in one generation. It doesn't take millions of years to do that. It doesn't take evolutionary processes. It could happen actually in one family. Theoretically, if this family with these parents with these kind of genes were to have children, they could have one child that was very, very dark, one that was very, very light, and a whole bunch in between, just on the statistics based on Mendelian genetics. And remember, Darwin didn't know anything about Mendelian genetics. Mendel's work didn't come out until a few years after Darwin. I often wonder if Mendel's work had come out earlier. A lot of the things that Darwin was trying to explain were explained very well with basic Mendelian genetics. And I often wonder what Darwin would have done with that kind of data had he known it. But we can get in one family here, twins, one very light, one very dark, coming from medium-skinned parents. And you can see the variation that's there, that's potentially possible. Science magazine back in 2017 had an article, How Africans Evolved a Palette of Skin Tones. I'm just going to give you a couple quotes from this. It says, researchers agree that our early Australopithecine ancestors in Africa probably had a light skin beneath furry pelts. How did they know that? Who saw it? What's the evidence? How do we know? And then the researcher, Tishkoff, his team found that the story of skin color evolution isn't so black and white. The study adds to established research undercutting old notions of race. You can't use skin color to classify humans, they say. There is so much diversity in Africans that there's no such thing as an African race. So, this whole idea of the skin colors and the races that we have all absorbed through our public school education needs to be reevaluated. From a biblical account, we started out with two human beings. We generated some diversity, and then there was an event that was called the Noah's Ark and the flood, which Dave will be talking about the evidences for the flood on Friday night. And so we hope you can come to that. That's fascinating. But after the flood, there was this event called the Tower of Babel. And after that time, we started out, remember, after the flood, how many people were on board the ark? 8. From the biblical record, 8 people from the biblical record. And so then they started diversifying again. The Bible says, God told them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And at that point, they were all of one language, according to the biblical record. At the Tower of Babel, they were going to build this tower to reach to the heavens, and it was meant to be an object of worship. And at that point, the Lord God, the creator of the universe, said no. He said, this isn't going to work. And so he confused the languages and separated the people into different languages, which caused them to spread out. And we've been privileged to be in many different nations around the world with creation teaching. And I can tell you, when you're in nations that speak different languages, our Creator did a very good job confusing the languages. It really is. Well, here's a question, fundamental question. According to evolution, how do you get new genetic information? It's got to come from someplace, right? If we started truly with molecules leading up to man, there's a whole huge amount of new genetics that has to be produced. How do we get that new genetic information? Darwin didn't know. He had an idea that he kind of agreed with Lamarckianism, which was the idea that acquired traits could be inherited, passed on from one generation to the next. He didn't really know about mutations, but he believed that there was something called natural selection, which select out the ones that were better suited to survive in varying environments. And so today, most people don't accept Lamarck's ideas, at least not in that traditional form. I mean, Lamarck said, well, at one point, the giraffe was a short-necked animal and there were droughts and they had to stretch their neck to reach up to the lower leaves of the trees and so on. And that extended neck was passed on to the next generation. Most people don't believe that anymore today as far as scientists go. But I wonder how much variation is possible with epigenetics. I always wonder, we have the DNA, right? And the DNA can be passed on from one generation to the next. And the idea has been, well, mutations or changes in the DNA are what are passed on, and then the good mutations are saved and the bad ones are weeded out. But that didn't really explain the interaction of organisms with their environment and the way that they can adapt. Epigenetics seems to be a way to do that. I'm not saying Lamarckianism, but I'm just wondering about this whole idea of epigenetics. Here, Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins, again, 2019, he says, everywhere they look, researchers are finding new examples of epigenetic modifications that add or remove special chemical tags in the organism's DNA structure without altering the genetic code. So the code itself stays the same, but these tags are put onto the molecule, which will then influence which sections are expressed, what parts of the DNA are expressed, and which ones aren't. And so he says what's even more incredible is these alterations can be inherited over multiple generations. Now that changes the game a bit, doesn't it? And very, very interesting. I'm really interested to see what's going to come out with this whole idea of epigenetics in the future, because the traditional neo-Darwinian concept has been that evolution proceeds by mutation plus natural selection. Mutation being changes in the genetic structure, changes in the DNA. What's going to happen with all this epigenetic stuff? I say stay tuned. I think it's really exciting, really interesting to see what's going to happen. But let's look at this whole idea. If we had a little beetle that someday got tired of getting chased by frogs and says, I'm gonna make a new defense system. And so this little beetle goes into the chemistry lab and he takes these various chemicals and he pours them together, trying to come up with a defense system. And wouldn't you know it, he never took a class in chemistry, so he's just dumping things at random. And one day he gets this combination of chemicals and kaboom. Instead of getting a better beetle, he gets a dead beetle. What happened? You know, just by random changes, random accidents, what's the option? What's the chances you're going to get something better? We know that when you introduce random changes into a system, it doesn't result in something better. At least not very often, right? I mean, if I had a paper all ready to go to turn in, or a thesis or something, and you're going to turn it into your advisor, and you leave it on your computer, and here comes a 2-year-old and starts playing on the keyboard, what are the chances it's going to work better? And it just isn't, is it? And so when we look at creatures like the bombardier beetle, which involve a complex interrelationship of organs and parts, there are special glands for producing these special chemicals. There's special mixing chambers. There's an explosion chamber. There's a way to control the speed and the force and the direction in which these little bursts of fiery material are shot out the back end of that beetle. That kind of thing doesn't come about by chance and accident. It looks like it was designed. What about the woodpecker? Woodpecker's a fantastic little bird, looks like a living jackhammer. Has specially designed claws for hanging onto the bark of a tree. His tail feathers act like a tripod to get a good firm stance on that tree. That little thing hits its head up against that tree hundreds of times a minute with a force up to 1,000 times the force of gravity. Now, how in the world did all those pieces and parts come together by accident? Think about it. If you take a normal bird and he hits his head against a tree, what's going to happen? Well, he's going to get a headache at the very least, right? But what keeps that bird from getting headaches? It just happens to have a layer of cartilage between the skull and the beak. How did that evolve? I mean, did the beak come first and then the cartilage? You know, you have to have the whole thing working together at the same time, or he'd knock himself silly every time he knocked his head against a tree. He also needs a very strong beak, because otherwise he's going to fold up that beak or just damage it somehow, right? And the eyeballs, there's a special film that comes over the eyes to keep the eyes in the sockets and to keep the wood chips out. You have to have all these special parts together at the same time to have a living jackhammer, this little woodpecker. Now, could it happen by accidents and chance? I don't believe it can. Now, some people will say, yes, I believe it can. You know, but when we look at the real world around us, we know that accidents and chance don't produce things as complex as the woodpecker. But he's got another problem here. This little woodpecker's going after a bug or something under the bark of the tree. And so here he is pounding against the bark of the tree. Meanwhile, that bug's going to crawl away and the woodpecker would starve, except that it's got a very long, sticky tongue. The tongue of that woodpecker is 4 times the length of its skull. Now think about it. How did that come about? By accidents. Did it just grow a little bit? How are these woodpeckers going to eat in the meantime? And so they need to have that long tongue, but what do you do with the tongue when it's not being used? Yeah, a woodpecker doesn't have a shirt pocket to tuck it into. Then can't wrap it around his neck. You know, what do you do if he leaves it hanging out? He's going to peck a hole in it. That doesn't work. Well, the storage system on this woodpecker is very amazing. It comes out the back of its mouth, it wraps around the skull and attaches back up in the beak area. The tongue is stretchy. When he needs it, he can stretch it out. When he doesn't need it, he can pull it right back up into that storage system. Which came first, the storage system or the tongue? Or did they grow little bit by little bit by little bit by accidents and chance? You know, that to me takes a lot of faith to believe. And remember, it takes faith. Yes, it takes faith to believe in a creator, but it also takes faith to believe complex systems like this could come about by accidents and chance and natural processes. To me, the idea of design by an intelligent creator makes a whole lot more sense than chance and accidents. Computers. These computers are amazingly designed, aren't they? They keep me. They give me headaches, right? This computer, though, even though it's amazingly designed, is nowhere near as good as your brain. You guys got a brain a whole lot better than a computer. Did you know that? Look at this. The total number of synapses in a brain roughly equals the number of stars in 1,500 Milky Way galaxies. What are the synapses? They're the little connections in the brain, the gaps that the nerve signals have to jump across. 1,500 Milky Way galaxies. That's a lot of connectors in your brain. A single human brain has more switches than all the computers and routers and internet connections on the earth. Don't you appreciate your brain a little more? Fantastic complexity. How did that come about? By accidents and chance over time. Now, I mean, if you want to believe it, it's your right to believe that. But for my way of thinking, it stretches credulity to think that these kind of fantastic systems can come about simply by accidents and chance. People that believe in this, though, oftentimes accept this whole idea called naturalism. Naturalism is a philosophical construct, or almost a religion, you could call it. And what it does is to say everything came about by natural processes, that all there is nature. and, tie our physical things and energy and so on. Naturalism says, well, perhaps an early cell billions of years ago developed sensitivity to other cells, then it is conceivable it would be on its way to becoming a human brain. Look at the hedge words, perhaps and conceivable, and maybe these things could have happened that way. We can imagine how mutations and natural selection operating over millions of years might refine or produce these systems. But remember, this is not science, this is speculation. Now, does science involve imagination? It does, because in order to put forward hypotheses, which are really educated guesses, we have to exercise imagination. So imagination has a place in science as far as proposing experiments to do, proposing hypotheses that we can test. But when we say we can imagine how a woodpecker could evolve or a brain could evolve, that's not a hypothesis that we can test in the laboratory, is it? What we do know about this world, though, is we do know that when we see a painting, there must be a painter. When we see a building, there must be a builder. And when we see a human cell, it tells me there has to be a creator that could create that human cell. Just like we know buildings don't build themselves and paintings don't result from an explosion in a paint factory. We realize that it takes intelligence to put together these systems in an order that will work. So what are the classical proposed mechanisms of neo-Darwinism then? They're mutation plus natural selection. Think about that a minute though. Neither mutations nor natural selection are really creative. Mutations don't create anything. They have to operate on something that's already in existence. You can't change something that's not there to change. Natural selections can only operate on things that are already there, right? If I offer you orange juice and grape juice, there's no way you can get apple juice out of that. You could select between things that are already there, but you can't create through that process. So you have to have a creative process to start with. Mutations operating just in and of themselves, they can't start anything really. And then we can look at actual scientific observations. And when we look at the actual observations, what do we find mutations produce? Things like two-headed snakes and cattle with extra legs and roosters without any feathers and all sorts of variations of fruit flies. You know, if you go into the genetics lab, I guess we're in the geology building here in earth sciences. But if you go over to the biology and genetics labs, you're going to find little fruit flies, right? Go in the lab. You can get all kinds of variations of mutations. So you get flies with no wings, and you get flies with curly wings, and you get flies with different kinds of bodies and all kinds of things. But they're still flies. Those fruit flies don't change into anything else. Even after hundreds and hundreds of generations of experiments that have been done, the fruit flies never evolved into what? Something different. Doesn't happen. They don't change into bumblebees. They don't change into anything else. And so flies are flies are flies. What do we observe from mutations? And these are actual observable results. And really think about it. What is science based on? Observation and experimentation, right? We can observe duplication of information. So maybe you have 4 wings instead of 2 wings on a fruit fly. That could be a mutation, but it didn't create anything new. It just was reproduced and had more of one thing. Or it could be a loss of information. So you can get fruit flies without any wings. You can get deregulation of genetic information. That happens by mutation. You might see that in cancer cells where they just go wild. Or you might see aging and death. These are what we actually observe mutations resulting in. They don't result in stuff that's new and better. If they did, we could say, well, wait a minute, let's do more nuclear testing so that we can have more mutations so we can evolve at a quicker rate. And everybody thinks, you know that's crazy. It's not going to happen. Well, Dr. John Sanford He's a geneticist with, used to be with Cornell University. He used to be an evolutionist when he started his research. He believed in mutation and natural selection. But as he did his research, he became very concerned that what he was seeing was mutations result in a downward trend in fitness for a population, not in new things, not in generating new kinds of things. Sanford wrote a book called Genetic Entropy. Entropy just means the disorder, a measure of the disorder. So genetic entropy means that as you introduce these mutational changes into a system, things are going to get worse, not better. And it builds up what we call a genetic load. We all have potentially lethal mutations in our bodies. Everybody does. But what maintains that fitness? Well, natural selection will weed out the worst of them, but this genetic load continues to build up. Stanford says evolution proceeds by mutation and natural selection. He calls that the primary axiom of Darwinian evolution, but then he says it does not work. And he, like I said, he's a retired Cornell University professor. He was one of the co-inventors of the gene gun process, which is the process that they used to decipher the DNA code early on with the human code. Here's a couple quotes from his book. Mutational entropy appears to be so large or so strong within large genomes that natural selection cannot reverse it. He said it's now clear that mutation and selection cannot even stop the loss of genetic information. So it could never create it in the first place, basically. Careful analysis on many levels consistently reveals the primary axiom is absolutely wrong. Now, what was the primary axiom? Evolution proceeds by mutation plus natural selection. Generally, that's what's being taught about evolution. He says this: if mutation and selection cannot prevent the degeneration of the genome, then the primary axiom is wrong. And look at the words, the strong words he's using. He says it's not just implausible, it's not just unlikely, it's absolutely dead wrong. It's an unsupported and discredited hypothesis which can be confidently rejected. So he's telling you, this is not me telling you, this is him telling you, if you're being taught evolution proceeds by mutation plus natural selection, he's saying you can confidently reject that. I have a couple copies of his book up here if you want to purchase one of those later, or order one online if you want more of that technical detail of what he's saying. So what are the mechanisms of evolution? Mutation and natural selection? We can confidently say no, these cannot explain the origin of new kinds of living things. So then the big question becomes, well, where do we get life in the first place? If we can't even get these changes to take place within created kinds, where did life come from in the first place? According to the evolutionary model, they will tell you it came about by that big bang and then, simple elements being produced, which get together to form more and more elements, which get together to form molecules, which eventually get together to form the very first living cells. But the question then is, who has seen that happen? There were no observers there. Nobody ever saw it happen. And so is this science or is it speculation? Everything we know about life, one of the very basic laws that we learn in biology classes, life comes only from life, right? Life comes from pre-existing life. So where did the first life come from? Had to come from a life giver, an intelligent designer who is alive. And the biblical record talks about that creator being the creator God. Does that require faith? Yes, it does. But does it also require faith to believe that things could come about without any kind of intelligence, simply by accidents and chance? I think that requires more faith, personally, because what we see and observe in nature is we know that it takes parents to get babies. You have to have existing life to get life. Here's a quote from Franklin Harold. He says this: we should reject as a matter of principle the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity. What's he saying? Reject the idea of intelligent design, just as a matter of principle. We're not going to allow it to come into the classroom. And then he says, we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. Now, they don't generally tell you that in your high school or college science classes, that it's based on speculation, because people were not there to observe it. And science is always changing, isn't it? And we're trying to learn more through science, but science works on the basis of observation and experimentation of the real world that we live in, not hopefully based on wishful speculations. So when it comes to change, we can just say, no, the mechanisms that have been proposed as mechanisms of evolution don't work. One of the other categories of things that they like to show you is similarity. They call this homology, and it's basically the similarities of structures. As they say, if we truly evolved, then we can see some similarities between creatures that were more closely related. So they will show you things like the man's arm and the dog's leg and the bird wing and so on. And they say, look at the similarity in structure. That similarity indicates that we had a common ancestor with those creatures. Is that the only explanation of similarity, though? I mean, you might see kids in the same family that have some similarities, but is there another explanation of why things might be similar than just common ancestry? I think there's some very good explanations. One is this idea that they were designed for a similar function. So they're a variation on the theme. You see that with human designers, don't you? Human engineers. You don't start from scratch when you're designing something new. You've got a base of knowledge information and you make adaptations on that. And so maybe it was designed for a similar function. Or maybe similarity is there indicating that things were designed by the same designer. You go into an art museum, you could, if you could recognize art, you can pick out the Rembrandts. You understand the style, the use of themes and colors and so on. And so we see we have one creator, not a pantheon of creators. Or maybe another reason why things are similar is they were designed to work together in an ecosystem. We have a limited number of chemicals in this world, don't we? And all living things must use those same types of chemicals. And so we would expect that there would be some similarities because we're designed to live in the same universe, the same ecosystems. But you see in textbooks a lot of times evidence that says, oh, but look, when the human being, little baby in the mother's womb, when it was about 2 months in development and had a gill slits and a yolk sac and a tail, that shows us that we're related to fish, right? These things they tell us were left over from those fish stage. Well, 2 things you should know about the gill slits. First of all, they're not gills, and secondly, they're not slits. So why would they be called gill slits? See, even in the terminology that they're using to define these things, there's a bias that is entered in. They're already assuming that we came from fish-like creatures, and so now we're just cementing that with what we call these things. What they do in humans is their pharyngeal pouches, they develop into the structures in the neck and the jaw region in humans. They don't develop the circulation of the gills. They're not gills at all. But they look a little similar to that area in fish development. So they say, look at that similarity. That must mean we have a common ancestor. Or maybe it means we have a common designer. You know, you start from a little ball and somehow you got to get to an elongated kind of a creature with various systems. And so we could expect there could be some similarities in that system. The yolk sac, so-called, in humans does not need, human babies don't need yolk. They get their nutrition from the mother. And so what it does is instead is to form the first blood cells for that little baby until it's big enough to make the blood and the bones and so on. The part they call a tail is not a tail at all. Looks a little like it here, but that end, it's just the end of the spinal column, and it grows a little more quickly than the rest of the baby at that point in development. Later on, it's enclosed in the body system. And, it's just the end of the spinal column. And so it's got to end somewhere. So all these things, we see that there's bias introduced even by the names that are given to these systems. Back in the late 1800s, Ernst Haeckel was a strong proponent of Darwinian evolution. And he proposed this idea called ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's a big mouthful, kids. If you learn that, you're going to sound really educated, right? Biogenetic law. Well, the idea was that the baby, the little human baby, would repeat the stages of evolution during the time of development. Well, that whole idea has been totally disproved. Haeckel's drawings were proved to be fraudulent. The differences are much more than what he showed in his drawings. We can just say no to that whole thing. It doesn't work that way. Today, what they're using more than structural similarity is biochemical similarity or biochemical homologies. And what do we mean here? Well, they're going to be looking at the sequences within the DNA molecule or the RNA molecule or the arrangement of amino acids in proteins. And looking at those similarities, they believe they can come up with this tree of life. And the idea being the things that are more closely related on that tree of life will have more similarities than those that are more distant relationships. Well, is it true? When we look at that, what do we see? Well, we see popular magazines picking up on that and claiming chimps and humans share almost 99% of their DNA. Does that mean that we're related? Not necessarily. Even if it was 99%, it wouldn't mean for sure that we were related. It might be, you might lean that direction, but it doesn't mean we're related just because we're similar. It could be because we were designed by the same designer, but that 99% isn't true anymore. It's coming down. It's been dumped down to 93%. Some are saying it's 86% now, maybe even down as low as 70% similarity. So really, it's not proving that anyway. In the book, Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has a good outline of this kind of thing if you want to look at that. But what if it was similar? I remember going to a museum down, I think in San Antonio, and they said, well, the mouse is 97.5% similar to humans. Maybe we evolved from mice instead of from chimps, like cheese, right? Or zebrafish, they said 92% similar. For this one I like, bananas, 50% similar. Does that mean we're related to bananas? Well, according to the overall evolutionary model, yes, at some point we are, our long distant relatives. Because they think that somehow all life, everything is related. According to the evolutionary model, I don't believe that. Way back in 1985, Michael Denson wrote a book called Evolution: A Theory in Crisis. He was not a creationist back then. I don't believe he is now. He's an intelligent design proponent now. But back then he said this: the really significant finding that comes to light by comparing protein amino acid sequences, it's impossible to arrange them in any sort of evolutionary series. And he said that back in 1985, and that's been confirmed over and again. Biologist Michael Lynch said this: clarification of phylogenetic, or that's evolutionary relationships of the major animal phyla, has been an elusive problem. Get the rest of this. Analyses based on different genes and even different analyses based on the same genes, yielding a diversity of phylogenetic or evolutionary trees. Wait a minute, you're analyzing the same genes and you're coming up with a different kind of evolutionary tree? That doesn't make sense. If this tree of life was a reality, with all of the research going on today, we should be getting closer and closer to the real tree of life. But in fact, we're getting farther and farther away from it. And New Scientist a few years ago had this whole edition on the cover. Darwin was wrong, uprooting Darwin's tree. In that article, they had a picture of Darwin's sketch of the first evolutionary tree of life. And look what it says up there in the corner. He says, I think that's what happened. It was just a speculation. He wrote it down in his journal, but it's become established in museums and textbooks around the world. And it has not been documented. It's not been seen. It's based on similarities, yes, but similarities. I guess I'm too excited here, huh? Similarity does not prove that evolution is true. There's other reasons why things could be similar. Is that still on? Okay. After I dropped it on the floor, we'll find out if mutations work, right? Here's a couple quotes from the article. For a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life. A few years ago, it looked as though that grail was within reach. But today, the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. And in the article, if you go to read the article, the evidence they're citing is DNA, and the new research coming out on the DNA. They say the tree of life, one of the iconic concepts of evolution, has turned out to be a figment of our imagination. Well, again, if it's in the textbook, then it should say, here's an imaginary tree of life. This is what we think what might have happened. It's speculation, but they don't do that. They put it in there and make it look like that's what's actually been found. And maybe at the higher levels of research, people understand this, but by the time it filters down to the students in the schools, or by the time it gets into the museums, it gets transmitted as if it's a proven scientific fact. When we know it's a figment of imagination. They say this, we have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. Wait a minute, what is it doing in all these places as evidence of evolution then? And then I love this, he says, biology is vastly more complex than we thought. And facing up to this complexity will be scary. Well, I don't believe it's scary. And I don't believe as creationists we should ever be afraid of real scientific advances and discoveries. Because what we as creationists want to do is to study this world to find out, what did our creator do? How did he put it together? How does it work? And we are just looking at this world to better understand this idea of the creator and what this world is. And so we shouldn't be scared by that. We should be very much excited by it. And in fact, modern science is really based on people who had a creationist view of the world. They believe there's a creator. In fact, some of the early scientists said that science is thinking God's thoughts after him. And so studying this world has really a creationist view behind it. This tree of life is being cut down by science itself. And so we can just say no to this idea of similarity that doesn't prove evolution. Remember what we're doing is we're looking at some of the classic supposed evidences of evolution. I believe there's a better explanation also for similarity then. What about this idea of junk? Well, they have this idea of what they call vestigial organs or useless leftovers. At one point in time, there was a list of 180 things in the human body they said were leftover from evolutionary development, including pituitary gland, thymus, tonsils, appendix, wisdom teeth. Well, wait a minute. Pituitary gland, now we know, is used for regulation. It's oftentimes called the master gland of the body. It's not a useless leftover at all. I mean, we wouldn't even be alive if we didn't either have replacement hormones or have our pituitary gland working. The thymus, the tonsils, the appendix have all been shown to be involved with immunity. And even the appendix now we know is involved in immunity. And wisdom teeth, what are they for? Chewing. They're just teeth. Now, yes, sometimes the development of your jaw is not quite big enough and the wisdom teeth become impacted or have to be removed. But just because something can go wrong with one of your organs, does that mean it had no purpose in the beginning? Not at all. I mean, you can have a problem with your heart, right? Does that mean your heart has no function? Not at all. Or people will say, well, you can live without your tonsils. So maybe they didn't have such an important function. Well, yes, I believe the creator put in backup systems because yes, we can live without our tonsils. But just because you can live without it doesn't mean that it had no purpose. You can live without your hand too, right? But that doesn't mean your hand has no purpose. And actually, from this standpoint of looking at vestigial organs as a creationist, as we look, and if we were to discover something new in the human body, what is our thinking going to be? Let's go to the lab. Let's find out. Let's do the research. Let's find out what that's there for, because as creationists, we believe that it was created good and that it had a purpose in the beginning. Evolution comes from the idea that it's all just without purpose, without design. It's just accidents and chance. And so from that standpoint, as creationists, we would say, yes, these things have a purpose. In fact, when they first discovered deciphered the DNA code, they said 97% of that DNA code is junk. It's leftover from evolution, has no purpose, no function. As a creationist back then, we said, no, it has a function. Let's do the research. Let's find out why it's there. And sure enough, this one did not take a long time. It took a few years here. But they're finding now that that's those sections that they said were junk DNA are not junk at all. They have very, very important purposes. John Sanford says it's becoming increasingly clear that most or all of our genome is functional. It has a function. Back in 2012, there was an international research project called the ENCODE project. They were looking at specific sections of this so-called junk DNA. And here's their conclusion. Almost every nucleotide is associated with a function. It's not useless leftovers, it has function. They said the metaphor of junk isn't that useful. And so the key point they said is it's not junk. Your DNA is functional. We believe it was created by an intelligent creator who has a purpose and a plan, not just for life as a whole, but for each one, each person, individually, specifically, designed by a creator with a purpose, with a function. Here are some of the functions of these non-protein coding sections of DNA that used to be called junk. Some of them are used for repairing DNA, assisting in DNA replication, regulating DNA transcription so that you can produce proteins, aiding in folding chromosomes, aiding in the maintenance of chromosomes, controlling RNA editing and splicing, helping fight disease, regulating embryological development, and many, 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 many more. And there's a huge amount of research coming out now. Human genome 20th anniversary, 2021 says junk DNA hits the trash. In 2015, there was a Nobel Prize given for deciphering some of the mechanism of DNA repair, discovering how cells repair their own DNA. Now, wouldn't it be nice to be able to have my computer repair itself? I would like that, yeah. The genome is a multi-dimensional operating system for an ultra-complex biological computer with built-in error, correcting, and self-modification codes. There are multiple overlapping DNA codes, RNA codes, and structural codes. Dr. Robert Carter, he did the video we have over here called The High-Tech Cell. He's talking about the DNA is not just a linear structure, the code, the A, D, C, and G, that forms that linear structure, but then it's also folded in particular ways. It has a 3D structure, very, very complex, not junk at all, but very important. So we can just say no to junk. What do we mean by imperfection? Well, that's the idea that some people will look at the eye and go, wow, if the eye was designed differently, we could see better. Well, is that true? I like what Darwin says in his day. He said, To this day, the eye makes me shudder. He didn't think his theory of evolution by natural selection could explain complex structures like the human eye. He saw these are challenges to his model. And yet today, Dr. Richard Dawkins, one of the leading evolutionists in the world, says the eye is absurdly designed. He says we got things in the path of the light that if it was changed, if the eye was designed differently, we could see better. Problem is, if the eye was designed the way that Dawkins said it should be designed, you'd go outside on a bright sunny day, you'd be blind within a couple of hours. I find this whole idea of absurd design to be a little bit of an arrogant argument, actually, because you're saying, I could do a better job. You know, I know better. I tend to think our creator knows better than I do how to design an eye, or Dawkins. Dr. Fred Lang is a friend of ours. He's an ophthalmologist from Costa Rica, eye surgeon down there. And he attended some of our training sessions. We had a very good time with him. Part of that training program, he needed to give a 15-minute talk on some topic. He chose to do it on the design of just simply the cornea, the clear part of your eye. And he said he could talk hours just on the cornea and weeks, probably more, talking about the complexity and structure of the human eye. Fantastically designed. What about DNA and molecular machines? These are fantastic little machines made totally of molecules, and they operate just like, well, this one operates like a little electric motor. There's all kinds of things in this thing. There's more than 20,000 at least, and I bet that's a lot higher than that, but they say there's more than 20,000 types of molecular machines in humans alone. These are real machines. They operate at a microscopic level. They can operate like folding machines or pumps or valves, force generators, energy producers, labeling machines, delivery machines, and many, many, many more. And you have more machines of these type in the tip of your little finger than there are in the world of other kinds of machines. One of these machines is the ATP synthase machine. Now, ATP is the molecule that is really a package of energy in living systems. But you need to make these ATP molecules and bring them about. Well, how do they do it? David Goodsell, a cell biologist, molecular machine modeler, says that they are one of the wonders of the molecular world. They're made of 32 different proteins. They have 2 distinct rotary motors that are joined by a stator. They're powered by protons. They spin at more than 9,000 revolutions per minute. Amazing. That's at the molecular level, by the way. Just amazing. Now, remember though, they had to start with a code in the DNA, and then that DNA had to be translated and had to be made into proteins in the ribosomes, transferred, by way of the messenger RNA to the ribosomes, where the proteins are put together, the amino acids put together in order, but that's not enough. Then they had to be folded precisely in order to be functional. And that's not even enough. Then they have to be transported by a molecular transport system that's phenomenal before it's even operational. Amazing, amazing complexity. Where did it come from? I think it came from creative design, right? Others will say, no, it happened by accident and chance. You need to make up your own mind on that. I think design, not imperfection. So we say to all these things, change, similarity, junk, and imperfection. We can say no. I say yes to design. It looks designed. What answers do the evolutionists provide? Well, here's a quote by Dr. Scott Todd. He says, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Wait a minute. What's he saying? If all the data point to design, we still have to reject it? We can't call it scientific? We have to just say, no, you can't go there with science. I think the whole theory of naturalism, the whole presumption of naturalism is what needs to be looked at here and questioned. Remember, evolution itself is not science, it's an interpretation. It's a belief system that's been used as a way of explaining or interpreting data. And it is a pillar of the naturalistic or godless worldview. So was Darwin wrong about biology? I think he was right about some things, but he was very wrong about others. But we have to give him cut him a little bit of slack. I mean, you know, he lived mid-1800s, really in mid-1800s. He didn't know anything about the molecules that we know about today. He did not know about Mendel's theories of genetics. He didn't know anything about the human cell. He thought the human cell or any cells were just little bags of protoplasm. He had no idea of all the contents of the cell and the little organelles within the cell and the complexity of the molecules and so on. He had no idea of DNA. Hadn't even been discovered yet. Didn't know that DNA makes proteins and proteins are needed for everything we see. And so when we look at what Darwin did, you know, he put forward some ideas, and those ideas have been picked up and added on by people today. But I think they're basing it on the wrong idea. What if Darwin had known about the complexity of life? What if he had known about DNA and the complexity of cells, biochemistry, and so on? Would he still have clung to evolution? We don't know for sure, because in the end, it's a faith. Whether you believe in evolution or creation involves a faith decision. It involves what are you willing to believe in? What are you willing to accept? For me, I believe that the evidence points directly to an intelligent designer, an intelligent creator. And that's what I could see from science. But then I can read in the Bible more information about that creator. And you see, you don't get that information strictly from science, but the biblical record has been looked at over and over and over again from an archaeological standpoint, from the standpoint of the manuscripts that have been used and the accuracy there. And over and again, the Bible, the #1 bestseller of books in all time, holds up to investigation. So I just would encourage you as intelligent human beings to use your intelligence to seek some answers. Don't just accept everything you've been given in school all the way along. Don't just accept it because somebody else told you that. Do the research, study it out for yourself, and see what you come up with. We encourage you to do that. We believe as you discover creation that you can go on to discover the creator then, and that creator that has a purpose and a plan for your human life. Evolution does not offer you that plan and purpose. It really doesn't offer you identity and purpose in life. Creation does. And so we want to encourage you with that. Tomorrow night, Dave will be talking about what do the fossils say about evolution. He says nothing because rocks don't talk. But we'll be looking at the fossils tomorrow night. And then the next night, we're going to be looking at geology. I love that talk on geology. I used to look at rock layers and immediately think millions and millions and millions of years of evolutionary history. And it took a lot of time, not millions of years, but it took us some time to say, wait a minute, is there another view of the rock layers?
And just to clarify, it's Friday night. You said that, but it says on the slide Thursday, so it's Friday night
Okay,
for the.
Friday night. Yeah, okay, we forgot to update that. All right. Science cries out creation. Discover creation, and then worship the creator. We're going to take some questions now. Dave's going to come up and give me a little relief of my voice, and he'll help with the questions. We'd like you just to do, well, Parnell, you're going to do moderate. Tell them one question at a time. If you have one follow-up question, that'll be good. Raise your hand, and we'll try to get through to everybody.
Yeah.
By the way, our website is called discovercreation.org if you would like to look further on there.
Yeah, if guys, when they ask a question, if you want to restate it on the microphone, then it'll be in the recording
Okay,
so that listeners know what you're answering.
There's a question way back there.
Can you hear me with the mask?
You can
Okay,
remove
I'll
the
take the
mask.
mask off. So at the beginning of your talk, I'm not going to quote you because I don't have the quote, but indicated that the reason we have racism today is because of Darwin and The Descent of Man. The Descent of Man was written and published in 1871. I'm pretty sure in the US, we fought a war about slavery that ended in 1865. So I'm wondering how you resolve that.
Yeah, I mean, if that's, I did not mean to say that Darwin originated the idea of racism.
No.
Racism had been around for a long, long time. What Darwin was trying to explain from a scientific point of view was why we have different races. So if that's the impression I left, I didn't mean that he didn't originate that idea. What he was doing though was trying to explain scientifically why we can have the various races.
Well, he certainly did believe in the idea of racism, as you can see from his writings, but at the same time, he was against slavery. So that's kind of an interesting conundrum there, isn't it? Okay. Way over there.
How old is the Earth?
Question is, how old is the Earth? How old do you want it to be?
I personally don't want it to be any amount, but I would say that the planet is billions of years old.
Okay. It basically, I can give you many methods of dating the Earth. Many different methods.
You need to be on the mic.
I think I'm probably picking up on that one, but okay. Okay, so I can actually give you a whole bunch of different methods relating to determining the age of the Earth. And those methods will give you ages all the way from billions of years, all the way down to thousands of years. And they're all based upon certain assumptions. It is a matter of which assumptions we're willing to accept and what we would reject. And so even among the radioactive decay dating methods that give you ages in terms of millions and maybe even a billion years or more, even within there, we find some issues. I can actually show you certain things that would give you an idea that when you try these methods on things of known age, it's the only way to tell if you're right or wrong, because you're always dating a rock of unknown age. I can actually show you that many, many times we've already had rocks of known age from recent volcanic lava flows ended up with dates in terms of millions of years up to a billion years, depending on where you are taking it. And so that can be an issue with that. Now, yes, there are, I can use the same type of radioactive decay dating, and even on some rocks, I can show you as a geologist that the date they got was that the rock hasn't happened yet. Now, I mean, there's a wide range of things that we have to understand
You can
here.
throw that one out.
What's that? I think I can throw that one out. I think so, okay? And then there's a whole list of many types of dating methods that give you the age of things in terms of thousands of years, not millions, okay? But like I say, you talked about different lenses. If your lens that you're using is telling you that evolution is a proven fact, now you're going to pick up a dating method that would allow for those millions and even billions of years in order to support that evolutionary model. Now, I was a geologist who believed in millions of years for years and years and years, even after I became a creationist. And then I was challenged to look into radioactive decay dating methods. And I found out when I started doing that, that there is a list of assumptions for radioactive decay dating that would occupy a page and a half of text, okay? That's a lot of assumptions. Many of those, as a geologist, I looked at that and said, wait a minute. How would somebody even believe that was a possibility, let alone an assumption in order to make the radioactive decay dating method work? And so when I started studying into that as both a mathematician and a geologist, I ended up having to say there are way too many problems to really accept this as a proven scientific method. Now you can have a follow-up on that one.
Yeah, so you mentioned that there are several different ways of dating things that can give a range of results. What would be one dating method that does give results that are in the thousands of years?
Basically, when you look at all the dating methods require, oh, go ahead, repeat it.
He's asking, you said that there were lots of different dating methods that would give you varying ages for which, can you give an example of one that would give thousands of years?
Okay, you can look at the amount of helium in zircon crystals. And you use one method, you come up with millions of years. Then you realize that zircon actually gives up the helium inside of a zircon crystal. How much helium is there? And you find out that helium diffusion will give you terms of a whole lot less, even hundreds of thousands of years, not millions of years. And some of those tests would give it to you in terms of thousand. And when I get a wide range of things, no matter what, if you're using radioactive decay dating or maybe zircon helium diffusion, I say a wide range tells me I don't trust any of those methods. Okay, that would be one potential.
Dissolve things. Elements dissolved in the oceans.
That was another one that elements dissolved in oceans. When you look at ocean basins, you find out that the ocean contains a lot of different elements. Okay, of course. Sodium being one, calcium, the big ones, basically. All right, and whole bunches more. And what they've ended up doing at one time was look at the amount of, let me think, that was the amount of sodium chloride in the oceans. Okay, and it turned out that you can do a calculation, you know how much, basically, you know how much sodium is being carried into the ocean every year through the rivers. Okay, fair enough. We knew that. And in a geology class that I had taken years ago, basically the professor showed us a calculation, how much sodium was being carried per year and how much sodium is in the ocean. You do a simple little division problem and you find out the ocean, according to this professor, and we did the calculation in class, turned out to be 300, let's say, I believe 300 million years old. Sounds good. Okay, but the ocean's been around a lot longer than that. But we, like I said, there are other chemicals besides sodium. If you use calcium, that number on the same way of doing it is only 2 million years. However, when you look at iron, it was 145 years, not million, 145. When you look at other elements, and you find the very same thing, there's a whole bunch of them. At one time, I had a list and a chart that showed, and I still have it, I can dig it out of my files. But one time I showed the files here, and I found out that there was a list of a whole bunch of these things. And when I looked at that on the list, when the professor pointed this out, it was 260 million years. That was the actual number. When I looked at what the professor had said, I just happened to have that chart in my briefcase that day. All right, I don't know why I had it there, God put it there, I think. But I looked on that list and all of the whole page of things. And I said, wait a minute, sure enough, the professor's right. Here we go, 260 million years for the amount of sodium. But then when I started looking down that list, I found every other one of the determinations was a whole lot less, even in terms of 100 years. And so I pointed this out to the professor that particular day. I said, not in a rude way. I said, sir, I notice on this list of what this type of method you're using, that you use the most ancient of all of those. Why? Well, I'm going to quote as directly as I can what he said. Well, I guess I just didn't realize they measured those other things. Okay, I could accept that. Okay, I could accept that, but he sounded a little nervous there. And but then 5 years later, I'm talking to some of his students, and they were studying for the exam. And I said, oh, what are you studying in your class today? And he said, oh, we're studying about this. And they mentioned something about the amount of how old the ocean basin was and how sodium proves it's 260 million years old. Okay. I said, did the professor say anything about any other elements like calcium or iron? He said, no, never mentioned that. And then you can just see my ears getting red. I'm thinking, now this professor, even though he knew he was given that chart, is only teaching what he wanted the students to hear. Unfortunately, we have people that do that occasionally. Okay, not all of them. Okay, some of them are going to do that.
I would just encourage you, if you can, to come on Friday night for that flood lecture. Because the flood itself and the evidence that Dave's going to present there will give you an alternative way to view the age of the earth and the rock layers and the fossils that are contained within those rock layers, and also an alternative way to view the erosional patterns that we see on the earth. It takes a flip in your brain, the worldview. I remember when that happened for us, because we had been trained and trained to look at the rock layers and think millions and millions of years. And yet when we went out and we started to look at it from a different point of view, we're going, whoa, because the rock layers themselves have evidence of being laid down catastrophically by water, not every layer, but most of them, over time, but not a lot of times, and then catastrophically eroded. So I would just encourage you, come and just see another point of view for that. We had a question over there.
Oh, yes, I do, doctor. I just want to play a thought experiment out in my head. If I were the common ancestor and I want to divide myself, billions of years later, why would it be in my interest to, well, make my offspring compete against each other? The goal is just expand and multiply.
Okay, he's asking a thought question, right?
Yeah.
If you were a creature millions of years ago and you wanted to divide yourself into two pathways, basically, of evolution,
Yeah.
what would that advantage be to create a competitor to yourself? Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, well, but you got to remember, it's by chance and accidents, first of all, so that creature is doing it purposefully. But, if you had a variations, here's the theory is there were variations and then some sort of physical process took place to divide the population. And then this one could evolve separately from this one. So they don't say we came directly from apes and monkeys, but we had a common ancestor sometime in the past. But it's always based on an isolation of small populations that will evolve, is the theory. But yeah, I mean, you wouldn't do it purposefully, would you? To create competition for yourself?
I hope not. No.
Okay,
But evolution is not a thought process.
yeah,
So,
Go ahead.
so do you, oh, did you guys call me?
you,
So what do you guys believe about like dinosaurs? Like, do you guys kind of believe in them or maybe like, what's that?
question, what do we believe about dinosaurs? Yeah, did they really exist? Are they really true? Well, Dave, growing up in western Colorado, spent his weekends going out looking for dinosaur bones out on the desert. And by the time he was out of his teens, he had discovered 3 complete dinosaur skeletons. We do not discount dinosaurs. We believe they were real, but we don't believe in the time frame. Okay, we believe they were real creatures. They lived and they grew to very large sizes. They died out at some point in time. We believe most of them died out during the flood, but that some of them survived and existed on the earth after the time of the flood. And that because of changing conditions on the earth and or human beings coming along and maybe even hunting them, that those dinosaurs eventually died out. Now, we can't even prove that there are no dinosaurs left today. Some people believe there are some left today. In the Congo in Africa, there's been reports of dinosaur-like creatures. We don't think they're as large today because the conditions are so different. Yeah.
We will have a presentation at our church meeting on Saturday night if you would like to come on dinosaurs. So their 4th presentation is on dinosaurs. It's going to be Dinosaurs and Dragons is the topic, the hard and the soft facts. So that's the name of the title. And they're going to talk about dinosaurs in human history in artifacts, things like that. They're also going to talk about dinosaur soft tissue. We have 2 articles here by another guy, Dr. Mark Armitage, who's a top microscopist on dinosaur soft tissue. If you want some, you can take it with you. 2 different articles on the right side of this table.
That's a very important. If dinosaurs died out millions of years ago, in fact, middle of Jurassic, say 140 million years, then why are you finding soft tissue in that dinosaur bone? In fact, even when I was a kid, not only did I find those dinosaurs, we used to do a lot of looking for a specific type of bone that didn't have paleontological significance. And the reason why is all you have is the hardcore left of the bone. And we would cut and polish that actually and make jewelry out of that. Okay, and so I did a lot of that. But occasionally when I'm grinding on a piece of petrified dinosaur bone, all of a sudden I would get a rotten egg smell. What does that mean? I did not understand the significance of that. When I was before 20, I didn't understand that at all. I didn't understand it until just a few years ago. The significance was I was grinding through rotting soft tissue and did not know about that, okay? Never dawned on me this is a problem. But yes, it's a problem trying to explain how you can get the soft tissue still preserved, even red blood cells and DNA in dinosaur fossils. And how do you do that over 100 million years? You know, that would have totally decayed. And now they're finding dinosaur soft tissue or soft tissue in other fossils. A lot of them, just a whole list of them. And it's interesting that some of them go back 200 supposed million years. Others go all the way back 500 million years into the Cambrian, which is a very unusual thing to try to explain. And since the soft tissue was discovered by Mary Schweitzer, I'll tell you what, it has caused some major ripples in the evolutionary explanations for dinosaurs. It really has. And the evolutionists who are studying that are scrambling to come up with some kind of an explanation. And there's been a few supported. I remember mentioning dinosaur soft tissue right here at this university. I had a professor stand up and say, oh, it's just biofilm. No, it wasn't. It turned out the biofilm was coming much later. And, but it turned out that now they're 100% accepted as soft tissue, soft pliable tissue, including DNA strands. And so they're coming up with other theories now as well. And they maybe do a little experiment, find out 2 years, oh, maybe we can preserve it in iron rich type things like hemoglobin. And, but the problem with that is you might be able to explain it for 2 years, but not 140, 180 million years. That's a stretch of the scientific investigation there.
It's also very interesting because once you start looking at this whole idea of the age of the earth and various ways of dating methods and so on, you start looking into things and you find out all kinds of research that's been done and observations that have been done that you never hear about in your typical coursework. And so it's kind of fun to look at the alternatives.
I'll give you just one good example for fun. There is a dinosaur that has been discovered, and the scientific name is Dracorex hogwartsia. Hogwartsia because it had a whole bunch of nubbins. Those are actually the core part where the horn would fit on, you might say, and then they would lose the horn later. But all kinds of horns on that crazy thing. And interesting thing about it is that it looks exactly like this dinosaur that they called that. Looks exactly like some of the dragons that were found in the drawings that they had in China and medieval Europe. And somebody said, well, maybe somebody saw the bones of Dracorex hogwartsia, okay? And that's what all the legends of dragons came from, except for one thing. In China and in Europe, they didn't have any of the fossils. The only place they found the fossil was North Dakota. Okay, long ways away. And so interesting. That's just one example, and we'll show you even pictures. I'll show you some pictures of some of these dinosaur-looking creatures that we recognize in the museum, but they're on cave walls, they're in pottery, other artifacts.
It's interesting too that the word dinosaur was not even invented until the 1800s sometime.
Yeah.
And before that, these creatures were referred to as dragons. So is it possible that what historically has been referred to as dragons and in historical legends and myths and so on, were they dinosaurs? We just didn't have that word back then. So come on Saturday.
I'll just bet that you guys, you over here, yeah, you. I'll bet you believe in dragons. Let me give you the classic definition of a dragon. Dragon was a large reptile. Now you believe in dragons, don't you?
Perhaps.
That's the classical definition. Now, could they breathe fire? Could they do? Yeah. Come Saturday night. Yes, your question.
The Zoom link, how do we get the Zoom link?
Okay.
Yes, sir. You can also sign up if you don't get a chance, just mention in the comments, send me the Zoom link. Just on the sign up. And I won't harass you, but I'll send you as soon as.
Okay, your question.
First of all, I think I just want to say thank you and coming over here and like giving this whole presentation. I think it was really cool. It was really informative. It really made me think a bit more about all the stuff I learned in high school and like the encyclopedias I read. And I'm actually in evolution class here at the U currently. And one of the professors of that class, the instructors, he's been doing research in the lab, and one of the research is he's been kind of like doing what he calls experimental evolution in microbes. So in microorganisms, things like Baker's yeast, he's been inducing multicellularity from unicellular organisms, things like that. And you've mentioned that a lot of these things, like for example, molecules turning into DNA in cells. These things, no one has ever observed them before. So how can we know that it's true? But this professor, he's observed those things you mentioned, mutation and natural selection, those core mechanisms of evolution, they take place in real time in the microorganisms. So the microorganisms with a particular mutation, that benefits them, they end up propelling their propagating their genes and offspring more. So they evolve, become more like that, and then they keep changing little bit by bit over time. So do you think it might be possible that mutation, natural selection, they could actually be viable mechanisms? Like these are real mechanisms. This has been observed. It's just that God has used them to kind of push design towards a particular purpose, in a sense.
You want to restate your
A
question?
big
So, I'm
lot.
sorry. I've just been building that as everyone is asking their questions.
Yes, right, yeah. Yeah, I've heard about the experiments where the microbes would get together and form clumps, the yeast one. And I haven't reviewed that recently. Do you remember it?
Yes, I do. I do remember that how they got it to clump was using a centrifuge, number one. Okay, so check that one out. Using to be able to clumping in the yeast. And that really didn't show too much because we have in the fossil record, we have solitary yeast and we do have multicellular yeast. It looks like that's what in the fossil record, we see that. There's another example. I think you're probably You're probably thinking about also the microorganism that is supposedly adapted in order to be able to, I'm going to say, digest citrates. That was one of them that has been used. I know there was somebody here that was actually working on that project. And but the interesting, all of a sudden they found out they were able to, through many generations, putting in that particular area, in that particular solution, eventually found out, wow, look at that. They evolved the ability to be able to digest the citrates. When you actually study what had occurred in order for that to happen, it was a breaking of a code that allowed it to happen. It was only because of the breaking of the code. Now, I have papers on that. I could dig out, I think on my computer, not this one, but mine over here. I have some of that can actually show you what that particular one was. And I'm wondering if that's the minor changes that they're seeing. And most of the time when we have something like that, that's so beneficial in a microbe, it's been the breaking of a system that is actually a de-evolution rather than an evolution getting better. And if you're interested, I certainly can give you the reference on that. Okay, but see me right afterwards. Okay, but you're right. Would God have used that? God can use whatever he wants, but I don't necessarily think that's what he did. And I'm thinking if we're misinterpreting possibly what we're looking at frequently. And you can find a chihuahua, a little hairless chihuahua is not going to do well on the Arctic ice. Okay. And a husky doesn't do well in the tropics. Okay, and that's for sure. So there is such a thing as natural selection. We would not deny that, period. And in fact, way back before Darwin, there was a general, what was his name? I wonder. He was actually presenting natural selection as a mechanism to preserve the species, not as a mechanism to make new and better species. Okay.
So the idea of natural selection has been pretty well established But when you think about natural selection, having said that, I mean, it's like, what is natural selection? Basically, it just says the things that are the best suited to a certain environment are the ones that survive. And then you say, well, which ones are best suited? Those that survive. It's kind of a tautological argument. It just goes around in circles. There's a clipboard coming around with, if you'd like to sign up for our free newsletters called Think and Believe, if you can just print your name and address on there clearly, we'll be happy to send that to you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Wait, so, we know that some species do become like extinct, right? I mean, that every year some like eventually die out.
Mhm.
So like, are all the species that we have right now gonna eventually run out? Like, are there like new species like being like crafted by intelligent like design at the moment? Or like, I guess I'm asking like, are we gonna run out if extinction inevitably occurs?
He's asking about, we observed that there are lots of species of things that have gone extinct. And are we someday going to run out of species? That's a theoretical question. I don't believe we will, because I believe that things are well designed, but you're right, that things do go extinct, that things do, changes do take place. Could be that they have fatal mutations that come in, so they would go extinct. Could be they just aren't suited in certain environments. So yes, indeed, extinction works, but I don't think we're going to run out. But that's just opinion.
And as far as extinction goes, we found out that in the last few hundred years, a lot of things went extinct at the hand of man, unfortunately. Okay.
Yeah, and creationists do believe in variation. And I think so within a kind, we think that within a kind, whatever a kind is of an animal, that there can be forming of various sub kinds maybe. So, we do think that that does happen. So we believe in like instead of a tree of life, some of us believe in an orchard of life. So there's created kinds, lots of different kinds. Within those kinds, you can have diversification. So, we have kinds of bears, for example, that are in niches. So you have polar bears, grizzly bears, but they can interbreed. But so we do believe there can be common ancestors. You know what I mean? But we believe whatever makes a kind genetically, it's not going to be able to change into some other kind, but we don't really know what a kind is. So some creationists think, some will say some organisms, the kind is at the family level, other organisms of the kind is at the genus level. For human beings, we'd say it's at the species level, I mean, I don't know if that helps.
We kind of have a historical definition of where the boundaries of that kind are based on the creation model that's given in Genesis chapter 1, that God created things after their own kind. And so this is an area of active research for creation scientists, though, is to try to understand what were those original created kinds and how much variation is possible within a created kind. When you think about the dogs, think about all the variety in dogs. I sometimes think maybe God made dogs just so we could see how much variation was possible within one created kind. Because now, of course, a lot of those specific species, varieties, not species, but a lot of the variety we see in dogs has been by humans doing artificial selection, right? You'd have a really hard time with a Saint Bernard and a Chihuahua in the natural, having natural reproduction take place, just physically. And so we see, though, human beings have been able to do that kind of artificial selection, and we get the various breeds. And so it is an area of research for creationists, though. There are some who are working on revising the classification scheme, even to say, okay, trying to understand what were the created kinds. They call it the bara min. Bara means created, min means kind in Hebrew. And so they're looking to see if we could trace backwards to find out what those created kinds really were. Yeah, Mark?
Could you comment maybe from a the opposite perspective on his point or his question. When you think about how delicate just the environment is and how unique Earth is as far as the balance of the ecosystem, and when we see this evidence of extinction and the rapidity of it here in recent history, speaks to just how delicate life on Earth is. And the opposite of that, right, would not lend towards an evolutionary growth, you know, to what we see in existence today, right? Unless you have the exact environment or, you know, unique environment that we do have here on Earth.
Yeah, the earth. Oh, repeat that.
Summarize it.
Okay, I gotta summarize that. He's bringing up the point that the earth is, they're just observing how much extinction we actually see, you know, today. And yet life is here on this planet. And the conditions for life are so narrow, really, in our universe. This planet has been specifically, we believe, specifically designed for life. It's the right distance from the sun. It's got the liquid water. It's got the right kind of pressures. It's got the moon to provide us with tides, which renew the oceans and so on. And there's lists and lists of conditions that make this earth inhabitable. But that, you know, and the various niches that various creatures can adapt to and survive in is phenomenal. It wouldn't be expected from an evolutionary point of view. I mean, we are unique as a planet. And if you look in the Bible, in Isaiah, it says that he created this earth not in vain, but he created it to be inhabited. Where the other planets, apparently, for all we know, were not created for that. Now, we can't prove that. We can't go to every place in the universe, but we have very, very specific conditions on this earth. And life is pretty amazing.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, you can. Here, I'll let you talk in here. So it'll go
I have to
on.
repeat it.
So I don't have to repeat it.
We were talking in Genesis about the creation of man, and it was kind of interesting because I really believe God put man here to, it was a word, but to manage this planet. We've probably done a bad job of managing it as we begin to look at how rapidly we've used up the resources which have caused these problems. You know, it's a chain reaction. So if we can re-educate ourselves about the proper management, proper use of the resources, I think we could prolong and make actually this planet a better place to live.
Yeah, that's one of the motivations for studying science, is to understand the physical processes on this earth. And you know, from a biblical point of view, as he was saying, mankind was put here and told to be stewards of the earth. It says to have dominion. We kind of in our modern mind think that means we're going to, you know, exercise just bad stuff on the earth. It doesn't mean to take advantage of it. It means to manage it well, to be good stewards of the earth. And so, yes, we as creationists have a strong motivation to take care of the earth, to manage it for God's purposes and plans, because he put us here for that purpose. But that, you know, so in one way we are environmentalists, but another way we are not going to be worshiping the earth. We're here to take care of it.
Thank you.
Can you comment on how a little more detail about whether natural selection and mutation can actually create the original information, right? Like DNA of a multicellular organism or something, you know, can natural selection and mutation create that?
Yeah. The thing to understand right there is that natural selection can only work on something that's already there. Okay, if it already has that ability, it can select for that. But the evolutionary paradigm has got to explain how you got that particular trait to be able to, say, adapt to ice on the Antarctic if you're a dog or a wolf or whatever you want, right? You have to have that genetic ability to be able to change. That means it's already in the genetic pool in order to be able to handle freezing temperatures in the Arctic. Okay, and so natural selection can only work on what's already there. And once you have that, okay, then that could, then you're on your way to be able to make a furrier dog, maybe. Okay, all right, or you know, Alaskan Husky, that's pretty nice. And but the hairless Chihuahua probably has that already pretty much removed from its genetic pool. It's not gonna do it very well, and it's not gonna do it in one generation, I can tell you that much. Okay, and get back to your question again. There is an article about, and I'm looking at the actual the minor microorganism change. All right, the minor microorganism change that we're talking about, like for instance, the citrate ability to digest citrates. That was Linsky's 20-year experiment. And in 20 years, he found out that they were able to go ahead and now be able to digest or utilize the citrate. And so that was touted as a tremendous advancement in evolutionary thought. The problem is it was actually a broken switch that allowed it to happen. And I found that article, I can show it to you, okay? All right, so I don't wanna, you know, it gets into quite a bit of technical stuff, but there's an answer to that one. And there's also an answer in the book. Oh, have you heard of the book by Richard Dawkins called the Evolution, the Greatest Show on Earth? He's a leading atheist. He used that as one evidence of evolution was Linsky's work. But the problem was there's another book written by Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, and it said evolution, the greatest hoax on earth. And he answered that in that particular book. But this particular article that I'm talking about is basically it's on bacteria evolving in the lab. I think that's exactly what you're talking about. And so I got a reference for you on that.
Any other questions? So if you guys want to, go ahead.
If that's okay, I
Yep,
just have one
please,
more.
Brian.
You mentioned earlier that so microevolution / adaptation / variation, that's something that happens, right? That's something that already happens, but it happens within kind of a limit. So it
Boundaries,
doesn't- boundaries, so it doesn't become as extreme as macroevolution. Could you say like what exactly defines those limits? How do you to what extent can something change before microevolution becomes macro?
Do you want to answer that? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a
I
good
get
question.
arguments.
We don't know where those limits
Yeah,
lie.
as I'm aware, it's kind of arbitrary.
Yeah, it is. It's an arbitrary thing. It's kind of a definition almost. And my guess would be that it's different for every different kind of creature. And we haven't defined those things yet. So it's creation science is not all sewed up in a box, you know. It is like any field of science, it continues to develop because science is always changing because we continue to learn new things. And so we need more people who come with an open mind, with a creationist bent, you might say, to do the research. Because what we're finding is it makes a difference what questions you ask, even what research questions you want to pursue, whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, right? I mean, most of I won't say most, but a lot of the research that's being funded today is funded based on the theory of evolution, trying to find out how evolution progresses. And I'm wondering what would happen if we had more money, more time, more people available to look more and more deeply into a creationist interpretation of the world.
Kind of playing off what he was saying, do you believe that you can maybe like continuously stack these micro evolutions? Like if you like kind of how humans might like breed corn to be like better or taller over time, do you believe that humans could like do something with animals and continuously only select like the biggest ones until there's such a point where like the biggest ones and the original ones couldn't reproduce anymore, and then that would originally be a species? Like, is that a viable thing? Like, is that able to be done? I guess is what I'm asking.
He's asking if we could stack microevolutions until we, what, make bigger creatures and so on?
Create a new species that can't reproduce with the original.
Oh,
Yeah.
create a new, yeah, you can, I believe you could do that. I mean, I think it's already been demonstrated with dogs. I mean, Chihuahuas and Saint Bernards are probably not gonna mate in the wild, right? But if you do artificial selection, they still can, but there's nothing that says you can't get to a barrier where it's just not possible anymore. So I think that that's a possibility. But the question is, can you create anything fundamentally new, you know, by continuing? But then you come back to that, and even if you could do that, you're not doing it by accidents and chance. You're doing it because we human beings have intelligence. And so, you know, some of the things that we can do, I think we're going to reach limits on things. But other things, you know, we may be able to do some things because we're created, and the Bible tells us we're created in the image of God. And so what is possible for human beings? At the Tower of Babel, God confused the languages, and he said, as it's recorded in scripture, now nothing will be impossible for them. And God was concerned, I believe, about the evil that we could generate on the earth, and he separated people out. We're probably approaching that time again where all human beings are able to communicate, the World Wide Web, you know, the internet, common language. Who knows what can happen in the future? And I really believe that as human beings, we may be able, our science may advance more quickly than our ethics and our morality, which is a bit scary. Because we could do things that are going to so damage the human genome and so damage this world that who knows where it would go from there. Now, biblically, from a biblical standpoint, I do believe that God is still, you know, sovereign and in control. And so we still have a God we deal with, but each individual that way is responsible to be that God. Thanks for coming.
I want to add one other thing. A lot of times we think about, okay, microevolution, that's great. And that bunches of microevolutions are going to produce macroevolution, correct? At least we think that way. But the problem is that no, it doesn't necessarily. And in fact, there was a conference on that very question. Does microevolution, which I'm not even sure I like the term because of the fact it's not evolution, it's just variation of the genetic pool normally that's already there. Okay, so that's no evolution because there's no new genetic stuff basically, or no fundamental differences. But the conference that was actually held was specifically a conference, does microevolution lead to macroevolution by a whole bunch of additional changes over millions of years? And the narrator of that whole thing, the moderator, basically summed it up from what the people were saying. And he said, not to do anybody here any injustice, but it appears like from what everybody is saying, that no, microevolution does not lead to macroevolution. And that was a conference of a few hundred research scientists in biology and evolution. Oh yeah, evolutionary biologists. And so that was the conclusion of that big conference. No, microevolution is not necessarily gonna lead to macro. Okay, another question.
So we're gonna end the presentation tonight formally, but if you'd like to hang out, we have the room till 10. So if you'd like to talk with the Nutties, feel free to have personal conversations or amongst us. Feel free to check out our info table. Feel free to look through their materials here that are just for looking, not for taking, on this table in front of me. Or you can purchase them if you want. Thank you for coming. Again, we'll have another presentation tomorrow night in this building at 7 o'clock. And that is going to be, I forgot the title, but we put it up there. You can grab a flyer. It's on fossils and geology on Friday night. And dinosaurs at church on Saturday night. We have church on Saturday night, and we have flyers about our church service there. If you would like to check out the message online, it's not going to be the same as the Zoom presentations on campus. So you'll want to, talk to me if you want to see the dinosaur presentation, because it's a different viewing